The steady hum of Manhattan pulsed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Hunt's penthouse. From this height, the city seemed distant, tamed. Below, a sea of glittering lights stretched in every direction, a perfect representation of the empire he had built. The world looked ordered from here, small, predictable, contained, just the way he liked it. Alexander stood with his hands in his pockets, his reflection a sharp silhouette in the darkened glass. His frame was tall, athletic not from sport but from discipline, a life carved with structure. The navy suit he wore was tailored within an inch of perfection, the white shirt beneath it crisp, unwrinkled. Everything about him, from his polished shoes to the controlled tension in his jaw, spoke of power without compromise. Control without question. Behind him, the penthouse was immaculate. Every surface gleamed, every item in its place. No clutter, no distractions. It was a space that reflected the man who lived in it, calculated, contained, curated like a gallery exhibit behind glass. The desk at the center of the room stood like a command station. On it, a tablet blinked with incoming reports, contracts needing review, decisions waiting to be made. Deadlines didn't rest, not even at night. Alexander turned away from the window with practiced precision and moved toward the desk. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders like armor he'd worn for so long it felt like skin. Yet there was one element in his life that refused to fall into line, one thing he had not yet managed to command or control. The soft pad of tiny footsteps on polished hardwood broke the silence. He looked up, his expression flickering with something unreadable, as a small figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. Clutching a threadbare teddy bear and wearing oversized pajamas, Sophia, his daughter 6 years old, stood in the doorway. Her hair was tousled, a messy halo around her solemn face. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, darted between her father and the dark behind her. "You're supposed to be asleep," Alexander said. His voice wasn't harsh, but it held the weight of expectation. "I couldn't," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. The bear's limbs dangled limply from her arms as she hugged it tighter. Alexander checked the time. Past 10. "You'll be tired tomorrow," he said. "Go back to bed." She nodded and turned without another word. Her small form disappeared down the corridor, swallowed by the pristine stillness of the apartment. He watched until she was gone. A tightness settled beneath his ribs, a familiar sensation he had trained himself to ignore. He told himself that structure was love, that routine was security, that discipline would raise a child strong enough to face the world the same way it had shaped him. It had to be enough. The next morning unfolded with its usual cadence, precise, clean, efficient. Alexander walked through the marble-floored lobby of Hunt Media Group with his assistant, Claire, trailing beside him. She was as polished as the building, sharp suit, sharper heels, and a tablet in hand, reading off appointments like clockwork. "Board prep at 9, investor lunch at 1, call with the legal team at 3, she listed. "And I've scheduled interviews for the nanny position this afternoon." That word, nanny, made him flinch, though he didn't show it. "You're overdue for a permanent hire," Claire added. "Sophia needs consistency." He offered a distracted grunt of agreement. The last nanny hadn't lasted more than a month, too lenient, too soft, always trying to play with Sophia instead of keeping her on schedule. He needed someone who understood that children needed direction, not distractions. Games and giggles had no place in his household. Claire hesitated. "There's one I'd like to push to the top of the list. She's highly recommended. Can start immediately." "Professional?" he asked without looking at her. "Extremely." He nodded. That was all he needed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Alexander returned home. The city glowed beneath a lavender sky, but his mind was already on tomorrow's agenda. He loosened his tie, placed his briefcase by the door, and pressed the security panel. Claire had scheduled the candidate for a preliminary meeting tonight. He expected punctuality. He expected credentials. He expected an older woman with years of childcare under her belt and no nonsense in her tone. The doorbell rang. Alexander straightened the cuff of his shirt and moved toward the entrance, already imagining the interview. He tapped the panel and unlocked the door. When it opened, everything paused. Standing there was not the woman he had imagined. Not even close. She was young, late 20s perhaps, warm brown skin, curly dark hair cascading past her shoulders in soft, natural waves. Her jeans were clean but casual, her blouse loose and airy. No clipboard, no credentials in hand. And her smile, wide, genuine, startling, seemed to cut through the air like sunlight through smoke. "Hi," she said, stepping forward and extending a hand. "I'm Mia Wilson." Alexander didn't move. His eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face. His brow furrowed. "You're not who I hired." She blinked, surprised, then laughed, a light musical sound. "Well, that's awkward. Claire told me you were expecting me." "My assistant knows better," he said sharply. Mia's smile didn't waver. "Looks like she thought you needed me." Before he could respond, a soft voice came from behind him. "Are you the new nanny?" Alexander turned. Sophia stood in the hallway again, bear in hand, eyes wide and full of cautious hope. Mia crouched slightly, smiling. "That's me. And you must be Sophia." The little girl nodded and inched closer, her gaze never leaving Mia's face. Alexander crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. He didn't like surprises, didn't like being caught off guard in his own home. But the week had been long, and the interviews had been exhausting, and he didn't have the bandwidth to start from scratch tonight. "Trial week," he said curtly. 1 week, no games, no nonsense. Mia's eyes flicked up to meet his. For a moment, something flickered there. Curiosity, perhaps? Defiance? Then she nodded. 1 week, she agreed. He told himself it was temporary, a test, a necessary compromise. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't have predicted, was how quickly the foundation of his ordered life would begin to shift. Not with defiance, but with laughter, and a little girl's smile he hadn't seen in years. The next morning, light spilled through the penthouse windows in long golden stripes, illuminating the polished hardwood floors with a painter's touch. Outside, the hum of New York resumed its eternal rhythm. Horns, footsteps, ambition. But within the walls of Alexander Hunt's perfectly controlled world, everything felt stalled. He sat at the dining table, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. Before him lay a financial report filled with numbers and projections, lines of precision that usually commanded his full attention. But today, his eyes barely skimmed the text. His mind was elsewhere. It wasn't the investors' meeting at 10 or the video call with the board scheduled for noon, not the contract negotiations queued for the afternoon. Those things would come and go like clockwork, as they always did. What lingered, what pulled at the edge of his focus like a loose thread, was the sound of laughter. Not just any laughter, his daughter's. Last night, returning early to retrieve a forgotten laptop, Alexander had stepped into a scene that didn't belong in his world. There, in the living room, Sophia had been sprawled on the floor amid a chaotic fortress of sofa cushions and blankets. Crayon drawings decorated the floor like leaves in autumn, and at the center of it all sat Mia, barefoot, laughing, cross-legged like she belonged there. Sophia had been giggling, truly unguardedly laughing, as she held up a drawing covered in hearts and shaky stick figures. It was the kind of laugh he hadn't heard in years, clear and light like wind chimes in spring, a sound that shook something deep within him. He hadn't entered the room, he hadn't said a word, he'd watched in silence, unseen, then retreated to his office, the forgotten laptop in hand, but with his thoughts unraveling. Now, in the sterile quiet of the morning, he stared at his coffee and felt that same unsettling tension. Something had cracked. He just didn't know what. Footsteps interrupted his reverie. Sophia entered the room, teddy bear tucked under her arm. Her movements were quiet, tentative. "Good morning," Alexander said, his tone measured. "Morning, Daddy," she replied, climbing into her chair. A few minutes later, Mia arrived. She wore a soft blue blouse and comfortable jeans, her curls pulled into a loose bun. That same disarming smile was on her face. "Morning, Sophia," she greeted warmly, and then nodded at Alexander. "Good morning." He gave her a brief nod but said nothing. As breakfast unfolded, Alexander found himself watching more than eating. He noticed how Sophia's posture softened when Mia was near, how her eyes lit up in response to the nanny's questions. There was ease in her manner, joy even. It made his chest ache. By the time he left for work, the feeling had only deepened. A sharp discomfort, like a pebble in his shoe. Over the next few days, the unease grew. Mia continued to fulfill every responsibility he had outlined. Punctual, efficient, organized. She followed the schedule to the letter. Sophia's meals were balanced, her homework complete, her bedtime kept sacred. But there was something else. An energy that flowed through the apartment like spring wind through open windows. Unscheduled. Unwelcome. It was in the music that played softly while Mia prepared lunch, in the sound of feet dancing on the kitchen tiles, in Sophia's newfound enthusiasm when recounting her day. Alexander told himself not to notice. He buried himself in work, left earlier, came home later. When he was home, he cloistered himself in his office, headphones in, eyes on spreadsheets. Still, the sounds of Mia's voice, of Sophia's laughter, trickled in through the cracks in the walls. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, he arrived home earlier than expected. He moved silently through the hall, loosening his tie. In the living room, he paused. Soft music filled the space, playing from Mia's phone on the side table. And there, beneath the warm glow of recessed lights, the two of them danced. Sophia spun slowly, arms out, her feet uncertain but determined. Mia mirrored her, barefoot, laughing, her movements fluid. It was a scene from a painting: light, love, life. Alexander didn't speak. He turned away. The next morning, he cornered Mia in the kitchen. "I didn't hire you to play games," he said flatly. Mia paused from slicing strawberries. Her eyes met his, calm but unreadable. "She's 6, she replied gently. "Play is how she learns." "She needs structure," he countered. "Discipline." Mia's gaze didn't waver. "She also needs joy." The words hung there, thick as honey. He left before she could say more. In the days that followed, the tension between them deepened. Mia didn't argue. She followed the rules more closely. She no longer played music while cooking. The drawings vanished from the fridge. The dancing stopped. Sophia noticed. She grew quieter at breakfast. Her stories faded into silence. Alexander told himself it was better this way. Safe. Controlled. But deep inside, he began to wonder if the cracks he'd noticed weren't in the walls. Maybe they were in him. Evenings had become heavier. Despite the careful schedules and the polished veneer of the penthouse, Alexander Hunt began to feel the weight of something he couldn't quite define pressing on him. It settled in the quiet spaces, between meetings, in the hush of the elevator ride up to the top floor, in the way Sophia no longer greeted him at the door, and in the way Mia moved silently through the apartment like a guest overstaying her welcome. He told himself that this was how things needed to be. After all, he had re-established the structure. Order had returned. The unpredictable warmth Mia brought into their lives had been dialed back, if not removed entirely. Music no longer floated through the hallways. Crayon drawings no longer cluttered the refrigerator door. Laughter had faded into polite quiet. So why did everything feel wrong? One night, after an especially exhausting call with international investors, Alexander sat alone in his office. The scotch on his desk remained untouched. The city glittered beyond the windows, but its lights felt distant, dull. On the laptop screen before him, the quarterly report glowed brightly, but its contents were unread, irrelevant. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing at his eyes. He could hear faint noises from Sophia's room, not laughter, just the soft hum of a bedtime story being read in Mia's low, soothing voice. And for some reason, it made his throat tighten. He rose, not entirely aware of his intent, and stepped into the hallway. The light from Sophia's room spilled across the floor in a golden ribbon. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Sophia was curled beneath her blanket, her bear tucked against her side. Mia sat beside the bed, legs folded underneath her, holding an open picture book. Her voice was gentle, patient. She didn't glance toward the door. She just kept reading, her cadence smooth and practiced. Alexander watched from the shadows. Sophia's eyelids drooped, her small fingers curled into Mia's sleeve. He turned away, retreating down the hall like a man trespassing in his own home. Later that night, he stood at the kitchen sink, staring into the dark. The reflection in the window showed a man who had always been confident in his rules, in his rigidity. But now, for the first time, he wondered whether his rules were fences or walls, and who they were really keeping out. The clang of mixing bowls, the squeal of a child's laughter, the soft hum of a woman's voice warm as sunlight through a kitchen window. Alexander tried to ignore it all. He sat at his desk, surrounded by the tools of his empire, email threads, market forecasts, merger proposals, but his attention drifted. Again and again, he glanced toward the hallway, toward the sounds that didn't belong in his world, but had, somehow, found a place. The clock ticked. He told himself to stay focused, to finish the report, to meet the deadline. But instead, he counted the minutes. And then, he got up. He moved down the hallway slowly, loosening his tie, a frown already forming. The scent of vanilla met him halfway. Vanilla and sugar and something warmer, something that tugged at his memory like a child's hand. As he reached the living room, the scene that unfolded stopped him. Flour dusted the air like snow. The counters were cluttered with mixing bowls and measuring cups. Crayon drawings lined the table, hearts and crooked letters scrawled across the pages. And in the middle of the kitchen, Sophia stood on a step stool, proudly icing a small cake, her cheeks flushed with effort and delight. Beside her, Mia knelt, her curls tied back, her sleeves rolled up. She was laughing, freely, fully, and guiding Sophia's hands with care. The moment was simple, messy, and so alive it made his throat tighten. "Surprise!" Sophia cried when she spotted him. "We made cake!" Alexander blinked. The mess, the disorder, the sticky fingerprints on the fridge, the chalk on the floor. It was everything he had told himself he didn't want. And yet, his daughter's smile was real. It wasn't polite. It wasn't careful. It was joy. He stepped forward slowly. "This is a lot." Sophia beamed. "Miss Mia helped. I did the sprinkles." Mia rose, brushing her hands on a dish towel. "We'll clean up." Alexander hesitated. He should have reprimanded them. He should have pointed to the chaos, but the words never came. Instead, he just nodded. "Okay." That night, the cake sat on the dining table in all its lopsided glory, and when Alexander took the first bite, something softened in his expression, not just because it was delicious, but because his daughter had made it. He watched her giggle, watched Mia smile as Sophia recounted the entire baking process in rapid-fire detail, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like a visitor in his own home. He felt present. He didn't say much, but he stayed at the table long after the cake was gone, just listening. And that night, he didn't work late. He just sat and let the silence be warm. The scream tore through the penthouse like a blade. Alexander bolted upright in bed, the sheets tangled around his legs, his heart hammering before his mind could even catch up. It was a sound no parent ever wanted to hear. High-pitched, raw, full of panic. He was already moving, bare feet thudding against the hardwood as he sprinted down the hallway. Another cry followed, this one broken, calling the same name over and over. "Miss Mia! Miss Mia!" He flung open Sophia's door. She was curled into herself, clutching her teddy bear so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair stuck to her damp forehead. Her eyes fluttered beneath heavy lids, unfocused and glazed. Sophia, he whispered, kneeling beside her. Sweetheart, she whimpered, her voice thin and trembling. Daddy, it hurts. He touched her forehead and felt the heat radiate off her like a furnace. Panic punched through him. He hadn't felt this kind of fear in years, not in business negotiations, not in courtroom battles. This was different. This was helpless. He didn't hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms, blankets and all. Her head lolled against his chest, small body limp, breathing shallow. The fever was high, too high. Mia! He bellowed, his voice cracking against the walls. Mia! She was already in the hallway, her eyes wide, barefoot and breathless, pulling a sweater over her head. What happened? She asked, rushing to meet him. She's burning up, Alexander snapped. I am taking her to the hospital. I'll come with you. He hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Grab her things. They moved like clockwork. Mia packed a small bag, Sophia's favorite blanket, her medical file, a water bottle. Alexander held his daughter close, whispering into her ear, promising it would be okay, that help was on the way. The elevator ride down was a blur. At the hospital, the waiting room was a kaleidoscope of motion and fluorescent light. Nurses asked questions. Doctors ran tests. Machines beeped. Sophia was hooked up to an IV. Her fever had spiked to 104.7. Alexander sat beside her bed, hands clenched, his composure unraveling with every passing second. Mia never left his side. She handled paperwork, talked to the nurses, made calls when he couldn't find the words. She sat across from him in the hospital room, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. At one point, he looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear she tried to hide, the calm she carried not for herself, but for him. Thank you, he said quietly. Mia looked at him. She's your daughter. You don't need to thank me. I do, he replied. You didn't have to be here, but you are. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Hours passed. The fever broke just before dawn. Sophia's breathing deepened. Her cheeks cooled. The doctor assured them she would recover. Relief hit Alexander like a wave. When they returned home the next morning, he didn't rush to his emails. He didn't change into a suit. He didn't go back to his routines. He sat beside his daughter's bed and held her hand. And when Mia brought in tea and toast, he didn't return to his office. He stayed, because nothing else mattered more. The morning after Sophia's fever broke, the world felt different. The sun poured through the windows like honey, warm and slow. For once, Alexander didn't wake to alarms or email alerts. He woke to the gentle rise and fall of his daughter's breathing, her small hand still wrapped loosely in his. He hadn't let go all night. Mia moved quietly through the apartment, making breakfast, tidying the scattered evidence of the night before. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make speeches. She simply stayed, anchored, dependable, present. Later that day, Alexander suggested they go to the park. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't in his calendar. He didn't ask Claire to block out his meetings or check his planner. He just went. The sky was wide and blue, the park buzzing with life. The sound of leaves rustling overhead was interrupted only by the distant laughter of children and the rhythmic thump of sneakers on jogging paths. It was a different world from boardrooms and penthouses. Sophia clung to his hand at first, shy and cautious, her steps uncertain, but her eyes sparkled beneath her lashes, and her grip loosened with each passing minute. When Mia arrived, dressed in a soft cream sweater and jeans, her curls pulled back, Sophia didn't wait for permission. She let go of her father's hand and ran. Mia bent low, catching her in a warm, wordless hug. Sophia buried her face in Mia's shoulder, a sound escaping her that was more sigh than laughter, relief, joy, something in between. Alexander watched them from a few steps away, a strange feeling blooming in his chest. He didn't rush to interrupt. He didn't clear his throat. He just stood still. When he approached, Mia rose slowly, her eyes meeting his. They stood like that for a beat too long, neither speaking but something passing between them. Something new. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Mia nodded. "You don't have to thank me. She's easy to love." He glanced at Sophia, now skipping ahead on the path, humming to herself, completely at ease. Then back to Mia. "So are you," he said before he could stop himself. Mia's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. She just held his gaze, the moment suspended between them. They walked together, slowly, unhurried. Sophia ran ahead and then circled back, then ran again. For once, Alexander didn't check his watch. He didn't count the minutes. He just walked side by side with the two people who had quietly, impossibly changed his world. It wasn't perfect. There were still things to work through, conversations to have, walls to lower, but this was a beginning, and he finally felt ready for it. When they returned home from the park, a gentle stillness settled over the penthouse, the kind of calm that didn't come from silence, but from peace. Sophia had fallen asleep on the ride back. Alexander carried her to her room without a word, laying her down and tucking the blankets gently around her. She murmured something in her sleep, curled against her bear and smiled. He watched her for a moment, then stepped into the hallway and closed the door softly. In the living room, Mia stood by the windows, slipping off her shoes. Her sweater hung loose around her shoulders. She turned slightly when she heard him, but neither of them spoke at first. The afternoon light filtered in through the tall glass, casting long, warm shadows across the polished floor. Dust motes danced lazily in the golden glow. It felt like standing inside a memory. "She's happy," Mia said quietly. Alexander nodded, his throat tightening. "She is." Mia looked at him, really looked at him, as if trying to see past the sharp lines and quiet commands to the man beneath. "You've changed," she said simply. Alexander raised a brow, half in challenge. "Have I?" She nodded. "You notice things now. You listen." He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I thought I was listening before. Not like this." They stood there in the quiet, two people who had once existed in entirely separate worlds. Now, those worlds were beginning to overlap, their edges blurred by shared moments, small kindnesses, and one little girl who had somehow brought down walls neither of them knew how to break. "I didn't expect any of this," he admitted. Mia smiled, soft and sad. "Neither did I." She moved toward the kitchen, but Alexander spoke before she disappeared down the hall. "Stay for dinner." Mia paused. "I mean, not as the nanny, just stay." Her eyes searched his for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right." Later, they sat at the dining table, not as employer and employee, but as two people slowly rewriting their story. There were still rules, still boundaries, still uncertainty, but there was also something else growing between them. Something neither of them wanted to name. Not yet, but it was there. And for the first time, that was enough.